Hello and welcome, everyone. I am so excited for tonight's Hold the Line because this is a woman who really holds the line in her way. Margaret Heffernan runs companies. She has written 6 books, more, I think, right? And I've just finished her most recent one, Uncharted. She is a management guru. I mean, she is so much. And so I will shut up and just introduce her to you, Margaret Heffernan. The author, the first book I ran into that Margaret wrote was a huge, it was named one of the most important business books of the decade. Willful Blindness is the title. Why we ignore the obvious at our peril. And I'm going to start there. Margaret, please tell us, why do people and this was at a time when I was in the middle of management crisis and, I could see the problems. We could see the problems, but we weren't fixing it. Why?
Yeah. Well, hi, Maria. It's a huge honor to be talking to you and to see you again. Willful blindness kind of came to me in the middle of the financial crisis, when everybody was running around like chickens with their heads cut off, saying, oh my goodness, we could never have seen this coming. It's, it's a black swan event. It's a freak event. And I remember thinking, oh, come on. For several years, people have been talking about how completely insane the property and mortgage market had become. People have been writing about this for several years. And I don't quite know how this happened, but what happened is then I started thinking about other things in history where everybody acted like it was a complete surprise, but actually everybody'd really known. And I thought about, child abuse in the Catholic Church. I thought about, anti-Semitism and fascism in Nazi Germany, where everybody kind of kept acting like life was really normal. Everything was fine, but everybody knew it really wasn't fine. And there was something about the whole narrative around the financial crisis that it was a bit like a magnet among iron filings, just organized kind of everything in my head around this idea of willful blindness. And I'd been writing a play for the BBC about the collapse of Enron. And when the chairman and chief executive of Enron were on trial, the judge in that trial cited the legal concept of willful blindness, which is defined as if there are things you could know and should know and somehow manage not to know, the law deems that you are culpable because you had the opportunity for knowledge and you shirked it. And this just became it just explained all the things in life I'd never understood. Like, how come everybody walks around acting like everything's fine when we all know everything isn't fine? And so I wrote this book in a kind of white rage, I think, of clarity. And it's a kind of odd book because although it does look at companies and institutions and organizations and government, it also looks at personal life and family life and that sort of thing, because I don't really read very many management books because they all assume that the person at work is this kind of weird creature who has no other existence. And I always think, but hang on, we go into work and then we come out of work and we are whole people, even if work only is interested in a subset of our capacity. And so I try in everything I do to weave together who we are as kind of, mothers, daughters, sisters, neighbors, friends, as well as colleagues, bosses, and subordinates. But I think willful blindness was important to me and to other people because I think there are a lot of people in the world, and Maria, you're definitely one of them, who kind of can't quite look away. And the friction between what the world is and how we're being told to see the world is just a profound irritant. And we can't quite numb ourselves enough not to keep noticing. And I think there are quite a lot of us, and we really need to stick together because it's a deeply uncomfortable place to live. But on the other hand, I don't think any of us would give it up, even if it's uncomfortable. For you, it's often dangerous and it's exhausting.
I'm going to ask you to take that, to where we are today now, because with technology, with the impact on democracy, we've talked about this, again, it's that same thing of, it's irritating because the world should be this way, but it feels like Alice in Wonderland, the world is crazy. How did you take this forward? What in your newest book is Uncharted, which you published last year. How did you take this forward, and that can give us advice on how we cope?
Yeah. Well, I think they're kind of two things. First of all, it's quite funny. I wrote in between Uncharted and Willful Blindness, I wrote another big book called A Bigger Prize.
A Bigger Prize.
Which is about which attacks our worship of competition as a motivating force. And I wrote it because when I was writing Willful Blindness, I kept thinking actually very competitive environments are specifically susceptible to willful blindness. And at the end of writing A Bigger Prize, my husband turned to me and he said, I think you're writing a trilogy. And I said, gee, that's interesting. Could you please tell me what the third book is going to be? And it took me quite a while to figure out what the third book was going to be. But the third book, which is Uncharted, really looks at the way in which we think about the future, and the way in which mostly the way we think about the future is completely wrong. So if you like, Willful Blindness is about how we get things wrong generally. A Bigger Prize is how competition really messes up our sense of reality. And Uncharted is about, how messed up our view of the future is. And there were a couple things that played into that. And one of them was this, to me, absurd narrative that we're all data. Actually, that's all humans are, really, is a combination, lots and lots of data points. And if we could collect all the data in the world about all the people in the world, then we could predict accurately everything that's going to happen to people. And I came across kind of absurd things, apps for deeply anxious parents bringing up their kids, which would kind of guarantee that they grow up to be Nobel laureates and all sorts of things. Something which I suspect early in your life, people mostly didn't predict about you, right?
Not at all.
Anyway, so there was that kind of crazy stuff. There was also, there was just this gushing of propaganda from Silicon Valley about, we're going to have driverless cars in 2017. We're going to be able to automate all these jobs out of existence. And I felt this really is propaganda. It's salesmanship. And what it was doing was making us feel that the future is already there. It's this kind of 10-ton truck, and it's just going to come and roll us all and run over all of us. And we really have no choice except to kind of lie down and be grateful. And that our inability to think creatively about the future was really stealing from us our capacity to make it and to voice, of all these cool new things happening, which ones we wanted and which ones we did not. And, I felt then, and I still feel very strongly, that there is a whole kind of message about inevitability in the future that deliberately or accidentally makes people feel hopeless, helpless, and passive, right? Driverless cars are going to come. There's tons of stuff that doesn't work about them. There's tons of legal stuff that we can't figure out, but too bad. They're going to come. You have no choice. There are no options. Just shut up and let us get on with making our gazillions. And I really wrote the book in order to try to help people retrieve their sense of agency and recognize that, nobody knows the future for the very simple reason it hasn't happened yet. And instead of finding this frightening, we should find this inspiring, because it means we have options in terms of where we want to go, what we want to do, who we want to support. And the very, very last thing we should do is surrender our agency, our capacity for action and voice.
hopeless, helpless, passive. I mean, oftentimes you're right. Like you feel like regardless of what you do, it's going to happen anyway. We're at one of those moments in the Philippines where the son of our former dictator, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., is actually the front runner by a landslide, more than 50% in the statistical surveys. Mm. So I've heard people say, well, it's going to happen anyway, especially business, right? So they're already preparing. How do you cope with that? How do you deal with that? How do you create it instead of being, a passive recipient of this future that hasn't even been determined?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing I do is I try to remind people that, history is full of surprises, and nothing's over until it's over. And I also try to disabuse them of this idea that outcomes are entirely predictable. Because I think once you think something's predictable, then you become really susceptible to the predictions that people spew out there. And I think, I guess the way in which I think about this is, all of us are brought up to think about cause and effect. And we think, well, if you do something, there's a cause and then there's an outcome, and it's obvious what it's going to be. And I try to explain to them about complexity, which means, there's a cause, and then the outcome may be some completely random thing, that you didn't see coming. It will be decades probably before we fully understand the cause of the COVID-19 pandemic. It wasn't caused by the fact that I forgot to wash my hair on, January the 3rd, even if one thing followed the next, right? And so I try to explain to people that actually in a complex system, which our life is, small things often have a disproportionate impact. You won't necessarily be able to see them ahead of time or even afterwards. But what you have, I think, a kind of moral obligation to do, and an obligation to yourself, is to push the things you believe in as much as you can, not expecting guarantees of success, only that if you do nothing you want is likely to happen. So there's this kind of asymmetry, which is I can do something and I don't know what's going to happen. But if I don't do anything, I know I'm not going to have any impact. That's the only guarantee that there is. So you may as well do something for two reasons. First of all, great things may come of it, and you don't know what those are going to be. But also you can live with yourself. And you can be an optimistic, creative presence for your kids, for your family, for your friends, for your neighbors. And if we all do that, that gives us all energy to keep going. I mean, I'm really, really struck by the fact that faced by insurmountable odds in all circumstances, really what keeps people going is each other. So we kind of have to do that for each other. And, I'm running this kind of insane project in the village where I live, trying to decarbonize the village. It's kind of, it's a tiny project. It's still excruciatingly difficult and complex. And is one tiny village in the UK, which is a tiny country, going to change the whole dynamic of climate change? Of course it isn't. But if we all did this, it would make a difference. I'm stunned by the number of other villages who are coming and saying, oh, gee, I heard what you're doing. How can we do that? And, to be selfish, if I weren't doing this, I'd be in despair. And that's no good to anybody. So to the degree that I can find something helpful to do, which can become helpful to other people, which means we all don't despair, the possibility of good things happening persists. We do nothing, we know exactly what happens. Nothing.
You kind of described my coping mechanism of the last 5 years. Right?
Yeah, because you can't do it alone. You can't sit with all that anger and fear and frustration. And I mean, I'm just really been amazed, in a lot of the work I've done, that you have one conversation with somebody who gets it and it gives you the energy to go on for weeks. But if you just sit with it, it's so corrosive.
Yeah, no, that's I'm going to come back to this question, but I want to go back to technology, because you
Okay.
in your book you talk about it as, are wanting to predict it. But I've talked about technology as also a way to control us, to that it
Yeah.
in some instances it's become a behavior modification system, and they, in order to make more money, they keep looking for more and more ways to make our reactions predictable. How do we get agency in an environment like that, where we don't even know that we're being insidiously manipulated?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing is, we do have a kind of obligation, I think, to be informed. I was reading something in the newspaper the other day about these smart TVs who, they're so smart they can watch and listen to us all the time. Isn't that cool? And I just sat there thinking, who in their right mind would buy one of these things? I mean, come on. So I think, it's really, really important that we understand the tools that we're using. And I mean, I'm a huge, huge fan of Shoshana Zuboff's book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. I'm heartbroken she rejected her editor's request to edit it, because it is a very long and very daunting book. And I think fewer people have read it as a consequence. But it is a deeply compelling argument that the intersection of surveillance technologies and capitalism gives this opportunity to modify human behavior on a massive scale, make huge amounts of money out of it, and make customers feel, that they're super clever because they've got all these gadgets and they can, spy on their children when they're out of town, and they can turn on the heating in their car when they're still inside their toasty home. And this is so cool and wonderful. And so I think, as citizens, we have an obligation to inform ourselves about what these things really do, figure out how to, disable them, figure out which ones we really don't want to touch at all, and talk to people about that. And, and again, I'm really amazed that, I'll see people, for example, wearing their Apple Watches, and I'll explain to them that they have just become the labor force of Apple. And some people think I'm stark raving mad, right? And other people think I really hadn't seen it that way. And they take the damn thing off and then go back to wearing a normal watch that does something useful for them, like telling the time, and doesn't give them little electric shocks so that, they can suddenly read the next urgent email. So I think it is really important. I'm also very encouraged, I have to say, by the huge movement to audit, analyze, and legislate AI. I mean, I think this is really, really positive. I'm not wildly surprised that it seems mostly to be led by women, which I think is really interesting. I'm really impressed by the degree to which they're just very cunning in seeing through the smoke screen. So, for example, I'm a big fan of Cathy O'Neill's work. Cathy wrote Weapons of Mass Destruction.
Yeah.
And I was talking to her about a lot of the makers of AI hiding their technology behind a smokescreen, saying, "Oh, but it's a trade secret. We can't tell you how it works." And she, she's a brilliant mathematician, but she came up with a beautiful piece of logic, which said, all you have to do is run the stuff and see who it hurts, right? You don't have to know how it's doing it. You just have to start analyzing it for who gets left out, who gets disproportionately harmed. That's what it's doing. You don't have to audit how it works. You have to audit its outcomes. Now, that's a brilliant piece of thinking.
And this whole saying, I think she was the one who said algorithms are opinions encoded,
exactly.
the bias. Yeah.
What they're looking for and the data that they use and the questions that they ask, all of those are subjective. They can't not be. Now, it doesn't mean they're all evil, but it means that, artificial intelligence doesn't have some super objectivity. In fact, it accelerates subjectivity. So we should accord it the same scrutiny and critical thinking that we do anything else that is a human opinion.
So you're incredibly nuanced and incredibly optimistic about people, and you actually are. It's in all your books, and yet at the same time, we're at a particularly dark time. You mentioned in your neighborhood, you're talking about climate, but climate is, and most people will just give up because, what can I do to it? I guess, this is, the last thing is, I guess, for us, how do you maintain that optimism? What advice, again, would you give us to deal with these existential problems?
Yeah. Well, I'll be honest with you and say, there are days I don't maintain that optimism. I'm sure you must feel the same at times, where you just want to pull the blanket over your head and fall asleep. But, and I think that's completely normal and probably healthy. But I also feel I have a kind of moral obligation to be optimistic. I feel, especially with my kids, I have to model the optimism I think they will need as they get older. And I really believe this thing, which a wonderful guy in Uncharted said to me: action is how you search. If you're doing something, even if you aren't sure where it's going to go, if you do something, you learn something. On the basis of the new knowledge, you can do something else. Sometimes it feels like walking through fog, but you eventually do get to some clarity. And I think the most important thing is that you just keep going. And I guess, in some ways, I learned this running companies, that there were days where I thought, I can't see how we get ourselves out of this hole. I can't see how we get the technology to work, or I can't see how I get the business plan to work. And the one thing is, well, you just keep going and you keep trying stuff. And if you do, you might figure it out. And if you quit, the game's over. And so I feel the same thing writing books, which is every book I've ever written started with something I just didn't understand. And I wanted to write the book in order to understand it. And every single book has a chapter in it which just gave me fits. I didn't know what I wanted to say, so I didn't know how to say it. And it blew the schedule out of the water. And it was really painful. And at every point I thought, this is the moment you realize, Margaret, you're just not a very good writer. But you keep going. You keep going, and then you figure it out. And this is much easier when you've had this crisis, several times. And then what I discovered is those are always the chapters I love the most, because they're where I learned the most. So there is this uncomfortable combination that the stuff that scares you, if you keep going, it's the stuff that kind of enlightens you.
I love that. That's those two things that you just said, action is how you search. And then, the way I would phrase what you just said is, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's, the first time I had one of these horrible chapters, my first book, and I thought, I'm not a writer. The second time, my second book, I thought, this is the famous second book problem. And the third book, which is Willful Blindness, and I had this problem. I thought, it's that bloody chapter. It's okay. Just keep going. Just keep going. If you keep going, you'll figure it out.
So this is my last question. With democracy in the balance, like here we go to another existential problem. With where we are today, looking down in a descent to tyranny, what do we do?
Well, I think I have more confidence in people's capacity to think for themselves than I probably ever had, in a strange way. And I write about this in the context of companies. There's this whole move towards open strategy, a recognition that there's in every organization, there's more knowledge at the edge than at the center. And if you involve everybody in strategic thinking, you come up with better strategy. But not only is it better strategy, you don't have to sell it to anybody because they were involved in making it. So actually executing it on it is much, much easier. And if you like, an organization run that way is a kind of democracy in action. And I don't think I really realized this when I was running companies, but it's how I ran them. And I think it's how we were able to do fairly amazing things that nobody had ever done before, because every single person felt they had a responsibility to bring their best to it. And when you create that environment, astounding things happen. Now, in the bigger, more political world, I understand this is really dangerous. You only have to look at what's happening in Myanmar today to see how dangerous it is. So I'm not romantic about this, and I am a physical coward, I have to say. But I just think it's really fundamental to keep faith with people's capacity to think for themselves, and to help each other. And if we continue to be honest with each other about the way that we see the world, we give confidence and courage to each other. And I think that's where we have to start and never give up, really. And I do believe really strongly, you can't do it only on condition that it'll work. You do it on condition that anything else is just miserable. Right?
Yeah, so absolutely agree. Margaret Heffernan, thank you. Thank you so very much for the optimism, the faith, and real knowledge for how we get through this time period. I'm Maria Ressa. Yes. Sorry, go ahead, Mark.
Well, thank you. I mean, you give me inspiration and faith. So good luck with your work, and anything I can do to help, please let me know.
Thank you again.
Okay.